Some people wait for heroes, others become one without thinking twice. Smoke filled the sky as Emily rushed down the street, her heart pounding at the sight before her. A house engulfed in flames, neighbors shouting in panic, sirens blaring in the distance, but the fire was spreading too fast. A woman stood near the gate screaming for help, her face streaked with tears. My baby is still inside." No one moved, the heat too intense, the flames too wild, but Emily did not hesitate. She was a nurse trained to save lives, and right now there was only one life that mattered. She covered her mouth with her sleeve and ran toward the door, ignoring the cries telling her to stop. Inside, the heat was unbearable, thick smoke choking the air, but she pushed forward, dropping to the floor to stay low. The sound of crackling wood filled her ears, glass shattering, the structure groaning under the weight of destruction. Then she heard it, a faint whimper from upstairs. She forced herself up the staircase, coughing with every breath, flames licking at the walls. The child, a little girl, no older than 4, was curled in the corner of a bedroom, crying. Emily rushed to her, scooping her up and shielding her as best as she could. She turned back only to see the hallway collapsing behind her, the exit blocked. There was no way back, no time to think, only time to act. Emily scanned the room through the thickening smoke. The window, it was their only chance. She kicked it open, glass splintering outward below. People screamed, watching from outside. Without a second thought, she grabbed the curtain, wrapped it around the child, and held her close. Pressing the girl tightly against her chest, she climbed onto the windowsill, her mind racing. The drop was high, but there was no other way. Taking a deep breath, she leaped, twisting her body mid-air to land on her back, shielding the child from the impact. She hit the ground hard, pain exploding through her side, but she refused to let go of the little girl. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the girl let out a cry. Emily loosened her grip, looking down at the tiny face streaked with soot, but unharmed. Relief washed over her as she whispered, "It's okay. You're safe now." The mother rushed forward, sobbing as she took her daughter into her arms, hugging her tightly. People cheered around them, but Emily could barely register it, her body aching, her vision swimming. Someone helped her sit up, asking if she was okay, but before she could respond, she heard a voice, firm and full of authority. "Who saved my daughter?" A man stepped through the crowd. His sharp suit was covered in ash, his face lined with worry, but there was something about him that made people step aside without a word. He knelt beside Emily, looking at her with eyes that held both gratitude and something deeper, recognition. "You went in there for her," he paused, studying her torn clothes, the bruises forming on her arms. "You didn't even hesitate." Emily blinked, trying to understand what was happening. Who was this man, and why did the crowd suddenly whisper his name like he was someone important? But she didn't have the strength to ask. She only knew that the child was safe, and that was all that mattered, before exhaustion took over and everything faded to black. When she woke up, she was in a hospital bed, a private room with soft white sheets and the steady beeping of a heart monitor. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow. The door opened, and the same man from before stepped inside, but this time he was not alone. The woman who had been crying outside the burning house stood beside him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved our daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Emily shifted slightly, wincing as pain shot through her side. "I just did what anyone would do," she said weakly, but the man shook his head. "No, you did what few would have the courage to do." He took a step closer, pulling out an envelope and placing it gently on the bedside table. "This is for you." Emily frowned. "What is it?" The woman smiled. "It's a token of our appreciation. We wanted to thank you properly." Emily hesitated. She didn't expect a reward. She had only done what she knew in her heart was right, but something in their eyes told her this was more than just a simple thank you. With a deep breath, she reached for the envelope, opening it slowly, and when she saw what was inside, her breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the documents. A full scholarship to the best medical school in the country. A personal letter from the hospital director offering her a position after graduation. A sum of money large enough to erase every debt she had and ensure she would never have to struggle again. Tears burned in her eyes as she looked up at the couple. They weren't just grateful, They were giving her a future, one she never imagined she could have. The man smiled softly. "We are the Whitmores. My wife and I built one of the largest medical foundations in the country, but none of that matters today. What matters is that you showed us what true compassion looks like. We want to make sure you can continue saving lives the way you were meant to." Emily felt her chest tighten. Overwhelmed, grateful, she had gone into that burning house expecting nothing but hoping to save a life. She had never imagined it would change her own. And as she lay there clutching the papers to her heart, she realized something. Sometimes the bravest decisions are the ones that lead us exactly where we are meant to be. Some acts of bravery save a life. Others change a life forever. Emily sat in her hospital bed, staring at the documents in her hands, struggling to believe that this was real. Just days ago, she was just a nurse working long shifts, barely making ends meet. Now she was being given a future she never even dreamed of, a full medical scholarship, a secure job offer at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, and enough financial support to ensure she would never struggle again. She looked up at Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, who watched her with warm, knowing smiles. She had saved their daughter without hesitation, and in return they had given her an opportunity most people could only wish for. But it wasn't just about the money or the scholarship, it was the belief they had in her. The recognition that her selfless act had meant something more than just that one moment in time. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Emily focused on her recovery, but something deep inside her had changed. The hospital room became a place of reflection, a space where she began to understand that what happened that night wasn't just an accident, it was a turning point. She had always wanted to help people, but now she had the means to do it on a much greater scale. One morning, as she packed her things, preparing for discharge, she received a visit from Mrs. Whitmore. The woman held her hands tightly, her eyes full of sincerity. "Emily, we know you never expected anything in return, but what you did changed our lives forever. My husband and I believe in giving back to those who deserve it, and you deserve this." She handed Emily a small key. "It's to your new apartment, fully furnished, fully paid for. You will have a home close to your university so you can focus on your studies without worry." Emily's hands shook as she took the key. She had spent so many years struggling, working extra shifts to barely afford rent, and now in one moment, she had not only been given a future, but also a place to call home. Months later, Emily found herself standing outside the doors of one of the top medical schools in the country, a place she never imagined she would be wearing, a student ID badge with her name proudly displayed, Emily Carter, medical student. She walked into the lecture hall feeling the weight of expectation, but also the fire of determination. She was here because someone had seen her worth, because she had proven to herself and to the world that courage and kindness were always rewarded in the end. As she settled into her studies, she kept in close contact with the Whitmores, visiting their daughter Sophia often. The little girl would run into her arms, giggling, calling her my hero. But Emily never saw herself that way. She had just been in the right place at the right time and had done what her heart told her was right. One afternoon, Mr. Whitmore invited her to dinner at their estate. As she arrived, she was greeted not just by the family, but by a group of doctors and philanthropists, people who had dedicated their lives to medical advancements and charity. "We want you to be part of something bigger," he said, leading her into a grand hall filled with people discussing ways to make healthcare accessible to those in need. "This is what true medicine is about, Emily. You didn't just save a life that night. You inspired something greater." Years later, Emily stood in front of a crowd at a charity gala as one of the youngest and most promising doctors in the field. She had graduated at the top of her class, completed her residency, and was now leading medical programs that helped underprivileged communities get the care they needed. The very hospital that once treated her injuries was now where she worked, and the very scholarship that changed her life was one she helped fund for others. As she spoke about her journey, she glanced at the Whitmores, who sat in the front row beaming with pride. If there was one thing she had learned, it was that life had a way of bringing the right people together in the most unexpected ways. A moment of courage, a leap of faith, and a heart that refused to turn away had led her to this moment, and she would never forget it. Emily had entered a burning house to save a child, never expecting anything in return, but in doing so, she had saved herself as well. and now she was doing what she was always meant to do, changing lives, one person at a time. Some moments defined courage, others redefined destiny. Emily sat in her office staring out at the city skyline. The past few years had been a whirlwind of growth, challenges, and transformation. She had gone from being a struggling nurse to a doctor leading initiatives that saved lives every day, and it had all started with one decision. A decision to run into a burning house without thinking twice. Her name had become known in the medical world not because of fame, but because of the impact she was making. The scholarship from the Whitmores had opened doors, but it was her dedication that had pushed her forward. She had worked relentlessly, earning the respect of her mentors and peers, and now she was not only a practicing doctor, but also the founder of a medical outreach program that provided health care to those who couldn't afford it. One evening, as she finished reviewing patient files, her phone rang. It was Mrs. Whitmore. "Emily, we need to see you. It's important." Her voice held urgency, but also something else. Something personal. Emily didn't hesitate. She arrived at the Whitmore estate within the hour, finding the couple seated in their grand living room. Mr. Whitmore sighed as he motioned for her to sit. "Emily, you have done so much more than we ever imagined when we first met you. You took the opportunity we gave and turned it into something beyond our expectations. We've been discussing this for a while, and we've come to a decision. We want you to lead our medical foundation." Emily's heart nearly stopped. Lead the Whitmore Medical Foundation, the organization that funded hospitals' research and life-saving medical programs across the country. She shook her head, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." Mrs. Whitmore smiled. "You don't have to say anything, just keep doing what you do best." Taking on the role was not easy, but Emily thrived under the challenge. She traveled across cities meeting doctors, patients, and community leaders. She expanded free healthcare programs, implemented better medical aid in underserved areas, and even started a new training program for young nurses who needed support just like she once had. One day she visited a small clinic that had just been funded by the foundation. A little girl, no older than 5, ran up to her beaming, "Thank you for helping us." She hugged Emily tightly before running back to her mother. Emily stood there frozen, remembering another little girl from years ago, Sophia, the child she had saved, the moment that had changed everything. She smiled to herself, realizing how life had come full circle. She had once saved a life without knowing whose child it was, and now, through her work, she was saving countless more. Years passed, and Emily continued to grow the foundation. One evening, she received an invitation to a prestigious medical event where she would be honored for her contributions. As she stood on stage accepting the award, she thought about the night everything changed. She thought about the fire, the fear, the leap of faith. And she realized something the moment she had rushed into that burning house. She hadn't just saved a little girl. She had saved herself. She had stepped into her purpose even before she knew what it was. As the crowd applauded, she looked at the Whitmores who sat in the front row, pride shining in their eyes. Sophia, now a young teenager, waved at her excitedly. And Emily knew she had found her true calling, not just as a doctor, but as someone who would always fight for those in need. Some risks are taken to save a life, others lead to something far greater. Emily sat in her office reviewing the latest expansion plans for the Whitmore Medical Foundation. The organization had grown beyond what she had ever imagined, reaching cities and communities that had once been forgotten. What had started as a desperate act to save a child had turned into a movement providing healthcare to thousands who would have never received it otherwise. She leaned back in her chair, remembering how far she had come. The struggling nurse who once worked double shifts just to survive was now sitting at the head of a foundation that changed lives every day. It still didn't feel real, but every time she walked through the halls of a newly built clinic, every time she saw a patient receive the care they needed, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Whitmore arrived at her office carrying an envelope with a knowing smile. "Emily, you've dedicated your life to others, and we couldn't be prouder of what you've built, but it's time for something more." He slid the envelope across the desk. She hesitated before picking it up, opening it carefully. Inside was a letter, an official government invitation. Emily's breath caught as she read the words, The Ministry of Health wanted her to join their advisory board to help shape national healthcare policies. They weren't just asking for her expertise, they were asking for her leadership. She looked up at Mr. Whitmore, eyes wide. "This is huge." He nodded. "It's exactly what you deserve. You've spent years fixing problems at the ground level. Now it's time to create solutions that will last for generations." The transition was overwhelming, but Emily took the challenge head on. She traveled to policy meetings, attended global medical conferences, and worked alongside some of the most influential healthcare leaders in the world. But no matter how far she went, she never lost sight of why she started. This was never about power or recognition. It was about ensuring no one was ever left behind when it came to medical care. One evening after a long day of meetings, she received a call from Mrs. Whitmore. "Sophia wants to see you," Emily smiled warmly. She had stayed close to the young girl she had once saved, watching her grow into a kind, intelligent teenager. When she arrived at the Whitmore estate, she found Sophia waiting with a bright, excited expression. Sophia held out a university acceptance letter I got in pre-med. "Just like you, Emily," felt a lump in her throat as she hugged her tightly. "That's incredible. I always knew you'd do great things." Sophia pulled back, her voice determined. "I want to be a doctor like you. I want to help people the way you helped me." Emily felt her heart swell with emotion, realizing that the night of the fire had done more than just save a life. It had sparked a future. Years later, Emily sat in the audience as Sophia walked across the stage to receive her medical degree. The same girl she had once carried out of a burning house was now ready to save lives herself. As Sophia turned to look at her, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of pride and gratitude. Life had a way of leading people exactly where they were meant to be. The fire had tested her courage, but it had also opened the door to a destiny she never expected. And now, as she continued to fight for better health care, as she watched Sophia step into her own journey, Emily knew one thing for certain. Heroes aren't just born in moments of crisis. They are made in the choices they make long after the fire has faded. Some choices are made in an instant. Others shape the future in ways no one expects. Emily sat at her desk overlooking the city skyline, thinking about how everything had started. One decision, one act of bravery had led her to this moment. The Whitmore Medical Foundation had expanded to new heights, and now, as part of the National Healthcare Advisory Board, she was pushing policies that would change the system for good. But despite all the success, she never forgot the reason behind it all. The moment she ran into that burning house to save a little girl's life. Every time she stepped into a hospital or spoke at a conference, she carried that memory with her. It was no longer just about medical aid or better policies. It was about ensuring that every single person in need had a chance to survive and thrive, just like she had given Sophia that day. One evening, as she prepared for an upcoming summit, her phone rang. It was Mr. Whitmore. There was something different in his voice, a mix of excitement and something deeper. "Something personal, Emily. We need you to come over. There's something we want to discuss." She arrived at the Whitmore estate within the hour, finding the family gathered around the dining table, but this wasn't an ordinary dinner. It felt more like a turning point. Mrs. Whitmore reached for Emily's hand with a smile. "We've watched you grow into an extraordinary woman. You've given everything to help others, and we know how much you care about the future of medicine." Mr. Whitmore nodded. "That's why we've decided to step down from the foundation. We want you to take over." Emily's breath caught, the weight of their words settling over her. She had never expected this. They had already given her more than she could ever repay, and now they wanted her to lead their entire legacy. Taking over the Whitmore Medical Foundation was the biggest responsibility Emily had ever faced. It wasn't just about running an organization. It was about carrying a name that had changed lives for decades. She dedicated herself to expanding its reach, ensuring that more hospitals and clinics were built in places that needed them most. She introduced programs that provided free medical education for students who couldn't afford it, because she knew what it felt like to struggle for a dream. One afternoon, while visiting a newly opened clinic, a woman approached her with a little boy holding her hand. She looked familiar, but it wasn't until she spoke that Emily realized who she was. "You saved my daughter from a fire years ago." Emily felt her heart skip a beat. The mother of the child she had once risked everything for was standing in front of her. "I never got to thank you properly," the woman continued. "But every day I look at my daughter and I remember what you did for us." Tears stung Emily's eyes as she knelt to meet the little boy's gaze. "You have a wonderful mom." She turned back to the woman. "Your daughter Sophia is doing incredible things now. She's studying medicine." The woman gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "I always knew she would want to follow in your footsteps." Years passed and Emily's work continued to grow. The foundation became one of the most influential medical organizations in the world. Her programs inspired countless young doctors and healthcare workers, and her policies reshaped the way hospitals operated across the country. One evening, she stood in a packed auditorium as she was honored for her contributions. But what made her heart swell was not the award. It was seeing Sophia in the audience, wearing her white coat, ready to begin her residency. After the event, Sophia hugged her tightly. "I wouldn't be here without you," Emily smiled, her voice filled with emotion. "Neither of us would be here without that moment." She looked around at the people whose lives had been changed and knew one thing for certain. That fire had not just saved a child, it had ignited a purpose, a mission, a future. Emily sat in her office years later watching as new doctors and nurses walked through the halls of a hospital she had helped build. Life had come full circle. She had never expected to be here, never imagined that one decision would lead to all of this. But now, as she continued to fight for better healthcare, as she watched new generations take on the mission she knew with absolute certainty, sometimes the bravest moments are the ones that rewrite your destiny forever.